أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Praise be to Allah, glory and praise be to Allah for another blessed day to come before you, brothers and sisters of this honorable audience of believing people and maybe even non-believing people, Muslim people and maybe even non-Muslim people, God willing. Today, I want to delve into a highly Islamic concept of uh, a subject matter, which sometimes we will talk about different things on this Sunday address. And I welcome you to our Sunday address. Our Sunday address is designed really to reach out to a wide group, a wide community of people, whether they are Muslim or whether they are non-Muslim. When you listen to this, it's our goal that you will be able to take away something valuable for your life. Now, if you're listening to this, 9 times out of 10, you have some interest in Islam. And I know that oftentimes we kind of won't go into the deeper aspects of the deen. And so today I want to go into that. I want to go into a beautiful discussion, which really helped me as I began to study Islam and to learn about the where we get our understanding from, where we find our knowledge about the religion. And that is the discussion around hadith. So today, my topic is titled, Let's Talk Hadith, towards developing Islamic life. And notice I titled it like this. It kind of has a little bit of a dynamic title because it's not just a scholarly discussion. Hadith is essential to be a Muslim. Hadith, and we're going to talk about the meaning of the word. We're going to talk about the origin, all that. But I want to start off with saying that this is something that if you want to begin to, if you're just studying, you're researching Islam on the internet, you're going to start, Googling different things, and you're going to come across this word, hadith. You're going to come across this word, sayings. You're going to come across this word, sahih, or collections, or it was phrases such as it was said. And what does it mean? What is all this stuff? Today, we're going to get to that. We're going to answer several of those questions. So this is a really good talk for a person who has a basic interest in Islam. You're trying to understand it, and you want to dig a little deeper. Okay. And let me begin correctly. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Inna salati wa nusuki wa ma yahya mamati lillahi rabbil alamin. La sharika Allahu wa bidhalika umirtu wa ana awwalul muslimin. Indeed, my prayer, my sacrifice, my life, and my death are all for Allah. No partner hath he. This I am the commanded, and I am the first of those who bow to his will in Islam. Isn't this a beautiful prayer? This beautiful prayer. I love it. And I started off with this prayer for a reason, because it mentions 4 principles. When in that little prayer I just said, it's in a salati, indeed, in that salati, indeed, my prayer, wa nusuki, my sacrifice, mahyaya, my life, mahyaya, mamati, and my death, mamati lillahi rabbil alamin, are all for Allah, Lord of the worlds. How do you know how to pray? How do you know how to make a sacrifice? Like if you actually go, the general sacrifice is, the sacrifice of your time or the sacrifice of your money, but there's a real sacrifice we do during the Eid, and we go take an animal and we sacrifice the animal for Allah. How do you even know how to do that? How do you know how to live your life as a Muslim? How do you know how to prepare for death as a Muslim? Well, the answer is we get these from 2 sources. We get our instructions from 2 sources. The first source is in the words of God themselves, the Holy Quran. This is the Kitab of Allah. This is the reference that Allah has given us. The second source is in the words of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as they were conserved and preserved by his companions. So there are 2 primary sources in the Islamic world, or the world of a Muslim. the Quran, and what we will call the Hadith. Often we'll say Quran and Sunnah, right? Quran and Sunnah. You hear this phrase, Quran and Sunnah, Quran and Sunnah. But the truth is that the Quran is the Sunnah. The Quran is the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad. Aisha, radiallahu anha, which was the wife of Prophet Muhammad, beloved wife of Prophet Muhammad, and a great scholar of Islam and preserver of Islamic knowledge, because she was his wife and she saw him behave in his acts and deeds. She said of him when asked, they said, tell us about the Prophet. Tell us something about the Prophet. How was he in his life? And she responded, the Prophet alayhi salam was a walking Quran. So the Quran is in fact the Sunnah, even though we will say Quran and Sunnah. But what do we mean when we say Quran and Sunnah? We actually mean the words of God as preserved in the Kitab and the actions, words, deeds, and omissions of his beloved Prophet Muhammad as conserved in what we will call the Hadith, what is called the Hadith. The beauty of Islam, one of the most beautiful aspects of this religion, is the intense and the scientific approach towards preserving, studying, critiquing, and passing on the words of our Prophet. This is done in a systematic and detailed manner, and unlike which is actually called usul hadith, or the study of hadith. Unlike the faith of other people, the sources of Islam are kept separate. So if you were a Christian, if you're coming from a Christian background, you'll know that the Bible is the book, right? But when you look into the Bible, you start to examine it, you'll notice that there are several people speaking throughout the book. So the reader is left kind of wondering at times who's saying what. And all you really got to do is manipulate the punctuation a little bit. You know, you capitalize a word that should be lowercase, and you will actually imply something different. For example, if you take the word God, you capitalize it with the big G. Well, the big G means the creator. But if you put a little g, then that can mean like an idol, right? All one small little difference of capitalization, or one small movement of a period at the end of a sentence, or comma, could literally change the meaning, let alone that it was translated from a different language that didn't even have punctuation marks. So what happens is the words of many people are all mixed together, and you kind of have to struggle to figure out who's saying what at times. So you have the words of God, God willing. You have the words of the prophets. You have the words of the disciples of the prophets. You have the words of the historian, and you actually got a few poets in there that have some of their words too. Then you have the words of the translator, and you have the words of the commentator. And then nowadays, you you have a Trump Bible, and so we don't even know what he has put into his Bible. So there's that too. You have later words of the later translators that may be interpolated into the Bible. So for a person in Islam, that would be a horror show because we don't put all that in one single book because of the confusion that I mentioned that it can create. So unlike in other faiths, the sources of Islam are kept separate rather than all mixed up in one. You have the words of God that are kept in the Quran. You have the words of the Prophet Muhammad. I didn't say prophets, not Suleiman. The words of Suleiman are not preserved in Hadith. The words of Adam are not preserved in Hadith. The words of Isa alayhi salam are not preserved in the Hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi salam. May peace and blessings be upon him and upon them all. The words of the companions and historians are contained in what we will call the Sirah. To make it simple, there's other phrases, but I'm going to use some basic terms so that you can be familiar and you can digest it. I don't want to make it too Arabicized. This isn't a class in that sense. I'm not teaching a scholarly class. This is just an introduction to the topic to give anybody who's interested a working understanding of what is Hadith, how does it relate to our life, and to begin to study and read Hadith, inshallah, God willing. The words, and finally, we have the words of the religious scholars that came later in time which we will call fiqh or usul, which is usul means the scientific study of something. You have usul hadith, which is the study of hadith. You have usul fiqh, which is the study of fiqh. So usul simply means science or intense study. The point is that whoever right here, that whoever follows one or the other, the point is that one will not make the mistake of the other, and we know who is saying what. We know who is saying what, meaning if God is speaking, we know Allah is speaking. If the prophet is speaking, then we know the prophet is speaking, not the historian, not the person that quoted him, but the prophet himself. Today, I want to discuss the second important source, most important source of guidance. So the first most important source of guidance in Islam is what? The Quran, the Kitabullah, right? The Holy Quran. Notice what it says on top. The meaning of the Holy Quran, the meaning. Why does it say the meaning? Because in this book, there is a translation. This is a translation. So this is kind of not, some people will say that's not a Quran, brother, because it has a translation in it. So they will say this little book, which is really old. I put a lot of time into this little book, which is, this is a actual Quran, right? Nothing but the words of Allah. That's it. Just nothing. I can't even touch it right now. I haven't made my wudu, so we don't even touch it if we're not in the state of wudu. We don't even touch the words. This is a out of respect, not because I'm gonna melt or I'm gonna get cursed, but we just have so much respect for the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The science of hadith is called usul hadith, and it is quite extensive. So it's way beyond what I will get to in this discussion. You know, a regular class on hadith, which I recommend you take one, and they can be taken free online or for a few little bucks. So if you're a Muslim, I definitely recommend it. But the science is quite extensive, and it can last over a whole, you know, a semester or 2 semesters, 2 or 3 years of study, because you don't just look at the hadith. They literally will memorize the different hadiths, the ones that are sound versus the ones that are not, etc. But we're not going to go that far. We're just going to kind of just get an introduction to the topic. Regarding the authority of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and let's start here. So we know that, and when it comes to authority in religion, that God, the word of God, we put at the top, right? And then after the word of God will be secondarily the word of his prophet, because the prophet is the mouthpiece and they relate the words of Allah. Allah has said clearly in his kitab, he who obeys the prophet obeys Allah. He who obeys the prophet obeys Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right? So in other words, if there was something that the prophet, oftentimes, let's go back to the truly my prayer. Allah says in the Quran, pray. Allah says in the Quran, pray at the beginning of the morning, pray at the top of the day, pray when the sun has, you know, reached past its zenith. So it will kind of describe this, but the details of how to pray are not clearly explained. You cannot get that out of the Quran. You have to look at the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Many things are stated in the Quran which need to elaboration and explanation, and it's the words of the Prophet that do that. Therefore, so this brings us to a point in the world today. You do have groups of people, particularly in the past, more so in the past, that outright rejected hadith and the sayings of the Prophet. Some even today, newer Muslims, I will say that there's a lot of newer Muslims, maybe they don't understand the value of the statements of the Prophet, and you'll sometimes, you know, I've heard people say, yeah, man, I just really just stick to the Quran, and, you know, I don't follow nothing else. But that invalidates the statement right here. He who obeys the Prophet obeys Allah. How can we obey Allah if we are not listening to his mouthpiece, which is the Prophet? In whichever time you live, if you were living in the time of Moses and Moses came to you and spoke to you, he who obeys Moses obeys Allah. If you were living in the time of Isa and Isa came and spoke to you, he was the voice of Allah. We are not living in the time of the prophets, but their words have been preserved by their followers, at least in the case of Prophet Muhammad, certainly in the case of Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. So he who obeys the Prophet obeys Allah. Surah 4, ayat 80. When it comes to memorizing the words of the Prophet alayhi salam, he said himself, "You who are here, take my words to those who are not here." And he actually said this. He said it a couple of times. So this statement here is one of those that was done in his last sermon. If you ever read the last sermon, you'll notice it's quite long. And if you're reading it, you might ask yourself, how do they memorize all this? The answer is he told people to write it down. He told people to write it down. That's a simple answer. He told people to write it down at the time he was saying it. And he even said in his narration, he said, "You who are here, take my words to those who are not here. Perhaps those who are here will bring my words to ones who have better comprehension of my words and will protect my words better." And was this not the case? This indeed was the case, that oftentimes the greater scholarship came in the later years from the students of the Sahaba. The Prophet ﷺ had died, and long after many of his close companions had died, the greater depth of scholarship. Why is this? Well, one reason is because in the later years, the Islamic world had formed. And just like in America, in the later years in America, we have roads, we have institutions, we have libraries. And so likewise in the Islamic world, they had roads, they had institutions, they had universities which would teach, and they had centers of Islamic learning. So the great scholars that we know that preserved the hadith of the prophets would journey to these places in order to learn them authentically, as is even done today. Even today, if you really want to get a profound and in-depth understanding, oftentimes brothers or sisters will journey to these traditional centers of Islamic learning. The Prophet ﷺ also said, "Those who have heard my words and memorized them should pass them on as they have heard them. As they have heard them," meaning don't change them, say them as you heard them, thus leading them to Allah's light. Alhamdulillah. There are many people who have knowledge that will understand better than they. That means over time, the understanding of, because he was a prophet, much of what he said was not apparent in his time, particularly when he spoke about the times, the signs of the hour. And as Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam was a prophet for all mankind until the end of time, then we know that he gave statements which would not become apparent until later generations. He made many statements that would not become apparent until later generations. For example, there's even a verse in the Quran that says, if you hide yourselves in towers built up on high, you cannot preserve yourself from death. And we saw what happened in our own lifetime. We saw 9/11 and the striking of the towers, and wow, that was profound. That those two events, the statement of the Quran was consistent with this statement of the reality that occurred later in history. That was a ayat from the Quran, but there are many hadiths that speak of the signs of the hour that will really maybe leave you crying, leave you afraid, which you should be. That's meant to pique your heart. It's meant to pierce our arrogance in the sense of we're going to live forever and never die. And so that's what these signs are for. So much of the signs of the hour become apparent later in history. What are hadith? Getting back to the point. Hadith are the words, sayings, actions, or omissions, things he didn't do, of the Prophet alayhi salam. Simple as that. The word hadith itself means narration, statement, or story. The word hadith is found in the Quran, and oftentimes in the Quran is translated story. He who brought me this story, but it can mean who brought me this saying or who brought me this narration. And these were all seen, the true and authentic hadiths were those that were related to us by his followers and later passed on to his students. And the hearer is known from the beginning until the end. What makes up a hadith? What makes a hadith a hadith? Very simple. Three things make up a hadith. First is who said it, the isnad, the chain. Who heard it? Who did he pass it to? Who did he pass it to? And then who did he pass it to? Or she. It could be he or she. Next is the text itself, meaning the statement itself. So if you say, indeed, actions are by intent. Okay. So who heard that is the chain. Umar ibn al-Khattab, it was narrated on the authority of Umar ibn al-Khattab that he heard the Prophet say, actions are by intent. That's the isnad, the chain. The text, actions are by intent, is the matan. That's the text, what it's saying. And then a third aspect that we would add it to is where it's held at, the collection, meaning how it's graded. Is it graded as some hadiths are considered to be the highest ones we call sahih or authentic, meaning these are those that we have almost no doubt. And we say almost, why? Because none of us were physically there to see it. Like none of us were physically there to hear it. So there's maybe that small sense of doubt. But as far as scholarship works and the ability to look and trace and know who said it, who passed it to who, there's no doubt. And there's basically the majority of scholars agree that this was said. After Sahih, then you have others of less sound authenticity, which may be called Hasan. They're graded. So Sahih is the authentic. Hasan would be good, meaning that it may have some deficiencies, maybe that they're not sure about some of the narrators. Maybe one of the narrators could have been sketchy. He has a sketchy character, and if so, it just downgrades the hadith itself. Even though the hadith may be beautiful, unless they can correlate the hadith with some other person, then the hadith will have a lower grade and will be called Hasan. And then the worst are da'if. So da'if is a large category of hadith, and I'll give you one da'if hadith that we hear a lot. We hear passed around, but it's just simply a well-known da'if hadith, which is seek knowledge from here to China. All right, so this is a well-known da'if hadith. Is it a beautiful statement? Yes, mashallah, it's beautiful. Yes, you should seek knowledge from here, cradle to the grave, right? You should seek knowledge from here to China. But did the Prophet say it? The answer is most likely he did not say it. Isnad. A little bit more about the chain. So I said a moment ago, hadiths have three primary aspects of a hadith. Who said it, what it says, and how it was graded. So the isnad or the chain consists of every person who narrated the hadith, from the first person to see it, the next, up until whoever put it into a major book. So up until the Imams, we have Bukhari, we have Muslim, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. But up until the time where it was added to a major collection, and those collections were dispersed all over the world. Study of the isnad. So, like I said, this is an entire class. I mean, this is an entire study. Like, you know how you can study biologists and you can just become a biologist, or you can study physics and just become a physicist. Well, likewise, you can just study isnads and become like a biographer of the Quran and a person who knows the origins of hadith. All right. So there's an entire science behind the study of the isnad, and this relates to the biographies of the companions of the Prophet, as well as his sirah, which is his life, study of his life. This study qualifies or disqualifies people who were supposed to have narrated these sayings. And this is where we get into, oh, okay, so how do they know who said what? How do they know what kind of guy he was? Who does all this? Well, there's actually specific people who dedicate their life to doing nothing more than studying these. Scholarship today will confirm or deny. It will either verify what the older scholars have said, or it will somehow undermine them and deny that. And most of what we see today has not been made to be wrong. In other words, most of the great scholarship of 800 years ago is still very well intact, and it has stood the test of time. Why we consider the collections of Bukhari and Muslim to be very authentic, very strong, and outside of the Quran, the most strongest books of authenticity. So there's an entire science behind the study of this knot. It relates to the biographies of the Prophet. This study qualifies or disqualifies people who were supposed to have narrated these sayings. And so, in other words, whenever you look at a saying of the Prophet, one of the things that we look at is who said it, who said he said it, and what was the character of this person. So, in other words, if a person was known to be a liar, his statements are rejected out of hand. No matter how beautiful the hadith, no matter how profound the hadith, if the only person narrating that one, and this is what we've learned about hadiths, the better ones, the truly profound ones, are narrated by many people. His wife, his cousins, the khalifs have said it. Many people will have said that. While those more lesser obscure hadiths and are lesser known, oftentimes those are the ones that were narrated by somebody who was not all the way right. So in other words, a person that may have not known the Prophet, if there was a hadith attributed to a person who didn't know the Prophet, then that hadith will be rejected. If there is a person who was known to have not remained a believer until his death, meaning that, yes, he lived in the time of the Prophet. Yes, he was there and he heard it. But before his death, he reverted to apostasy or he became some kind of bad criminal, then that hadith is rejected. If a person was known to have committed major sins, back to what I said a moment ago, this guy was known to have been a fornicator. Well, if he was a committer of major sins, and this means then he probably was also a liar. And so his character cannot be accepted, and we will reject his words as well. If a person was known to have not been able to have heard the hadith they were narrating, for example, someone narrates the hadith that at the Battle of Badr, Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam threw dust at the disbelievers, right? And then, but it was known that at the Battle of Badr, this guy wasn't even born. Well, then this hadith is rejected from him. It can be accepted maybe from some other people who may have seen it, but from that person, it cannot be accepted. So the isnad is an entire science that examines the statements, the people who saw it, the people who passed it on, their character, their lives. We know all kinds of things about them. And this is in stark contrast to the narrators of the book that we call the Bible. Stark contrast. Often many books in the Bible are unauthored. We don't know who wrote them. We don't know who wrote them, who passed them on. We often don't even know why they were put in the Bible. So when you come into Islam, this is a big difference from other faiths. I don't know about Buddhism and Hinduism, things like that, but I do know about Christianity and Islam. And so this is very, very different. And I was impressed. In fact, I found out later that the methodology used in Islam is actually utilized in modern jurisprudence in our country today, like to examine the character of a witness and the character. This is actually some of the same standards that are used in modern jurisprudence in criminal law in our country today. The point about isnad, the chain. Not just any statements are accepted from the Prophet. So in contrast to other books, as I mentioned, such as the Bible, stories in the Bible are often not known who the author is. Many books in the Bible, you'll say, let's say the Gospel of the book of Isaiah, for example. So it's known that the book of Isaiah was written by something like 6 or 7 different people, maybe if not more. The book of Psalms was written by multiple different people. We don't know who ultimately wrote it. So often those books are attributed to entire groups of people. And so by not being able to determine who said what, we don't even know if we can validly say that these are the words of God. Although, yes, many of them are beautiful statements. They're beautiful words. But if God did not say them, how can we attribute something to him that is not true? These people who are supposed to have narrated parts of the Bible were known to have not even been present nor even born. For example, Paul, who was known to have written at least something like 15 gospels in the Bible, was known to have never met Isa alayhi salam. He never met Jesus. He was a murderer of Christians who claimed to have a conversion. So the fact that he was a murderer would have invalidated him as a source of knowledge because he was known to have been a criminal. We don't know any people who were criminals that are the sources of Islamic knowledge. We don't know that. They were not known to have been criminals while they were Muslim. Paul was known to have been a criminal in his lifetime, and he was known to have lied. And you can even actually go into the books themselves and see where he lies. And he even says, hey, if by my lie people came to faith, why are you angry with me? If by my lie I filled up the congregation, I bring you money, why are you angry with me? You see? And so this is not valid in Islam. We would have to reject his statements. Some of the narrators of the Bible were said to have been, okay, so I covered that, and some were known to have been outright liars. All right. So the study of the text itself. The science of studying the text is a very rigorous one, as I've mentioned. For example, if the text contradicts the Quran, so now when we're talking about the text, we're talking about the words, not the people. So if the text itself goes against what the Quran says, then we will reject this. You don't have to go through Bukhari and Muslim looking for that, because the majority of those hadiths, they have already, you can tell, none of them contradict the Quran. Although some of them may be difficult for us to understand or even to accept in our time, because they apply to the culture of a people who were Bedouin. Some of them were Bedouin who lived in 600 AD Arabia. So they will definitely have different customs that may not apply to us today. We take the ones that apply, we take the ones that are relevant, and those other ones, alhamdulillah, we leave those. If the text has internal contradictions, it is rejected. If the text includes foreign words that are not used in Arabic, so in other words, the text has phrases that are not even Arabic, there's some other, or Farsi or Urdu or something like this, then we know this hadith did not come from the Prophet alayhi salam. If the text includes statements that the prophet was known not to have said and not to have done, meaning he didn't say these, we know he didn't say these, and we know he didn't do these things, then we will reject that text. And it goes on and on. I'm just giving you some ideas that so you can understand, okay, so these hadiths are rigorously studied by generation after generation after generation of Muslims. The compilations, this is the third aspect. So we have those who spoke it, the isnad, what it says, the matan, and how it's graded and compiled, which is compilations. Most of the work has been done by previous imams, mashallah. We benefit from the fruit of the studying of these prior scholars who traveled, and many of them, particularly the big ones like Bukhari, Muslim, they traveled to the Islamic world in order to hear hadiths. For example, Imam Bukhari was known to have collected over 200,000 hadiths. And he only published 2,000 to 3,000 of those. I think it's like 2,500 or something like that. That's like 1%. He published like 10%, like 2,000 of 200,000, I think is 10%. Barely 10%. I mean, 90% of what he collected, he never published it. So that 90% will go into other places that we will call da'if or it'll have some other label, but it will not be included in what we call the Sahih, or the authentic versions of the sayings of the Prophet. So while there are many collections throughout history, today we've narrowed it down pretty much to about 6 main collections that you will often hear imams refer to whenever we teach. Most of us, we don't go off into obscureness. We pretty much stay on that main, even, open, clear path. Because as new people to the religion, we don't need all that in depth. We really kind of just need those basic things that give us the structure of our Islamic life, that help us develop an Islamic character, help us develop our approach to the religion, and help us to understand what the Quran is telling us to do. So today we've narrowed it down to about 6 basic collections that, if you are Muslim, you've probably heard some of these names. If you're not, they may be new to you. Imam Bukhari, mentioned him a moment ago, the most authentic. Why? Because he used profoundly rigorous standards. Does that mean that he has no flaws, errors, or mistakes? Of course not. He's human, right? So in anything that a human does, you can find flaws, errors, and mistakes. You have his student, who was Imam Muslim, was a student of Imam Bukhari. So guess what standards he used? He used Imam Bukhari's standards and some other standards of his own that were considered to be very intense. And some people were just frustrated because they feel like, they were too intense. But that strong analysis gave us the pearls of wisdom that we have. And don't we have some beautiful, beautiful sayings of the Prophet? Some of the others include Imam Ahmed, Ibn Hanbal, Ibn Nisa, Imam Abu Dawood, and Imam Tirmidhi. So these are just a few. These are just 6 that I chose to mention here today. There are literally hundreds of compilations, but these 6, there's about 9 actually that are commonly referred, and these are what we call the Sahih Sitta, or the authentic 6. The authentic 6. Whenever using, citing, or applying the hadith, it is best to stay within the collections that are most widely accepted. And so this is what I do as a teacher of the religion. And as a student of the religion, I don't, unless I'm in a hadith class where we're going to analyze this, and we're going to break it down, we're going to break down the Arabic, and we're going to talk about who the narrators were, I don't go off into anything obscure. I stay on the most authentic. And truly, that's enough, especially for beginners. Unless you've been studying this since you were 6 years old or 8 years old, this is enough for you. Just studying the basic collection, what's basically there on top, is really sufficient for us. And that brings us to Imam Nawawi. Imam Nawawi. And I spoke on this because I've been teaching this class at different places called the 40 Hadith. And I've taken a class called the 40 Hadith. And it was one of the best classes that I've taken because it really kind of filled out my understanding of the words of the Prophet, what he said and what he intended for us. And so one of these later scholars of Islam is called Imam Nawawi. He's a Muslim scholar. He lived around 1200 AD. And he's from Damascus, Syria, which today still exists, of course, and where people would often go in that time, and even up until today's times, if not for the Civil War, to study. This is a center of Islamic learning, not only to study the Quran. This is a center of Christian learning as well. The oldest Christian Bible on earth is in Syria, in the same city or around Damascus. So they say Paul the Apostle was on the road to what? He was on the road to Damascus, right? So that lets you know how far back the ancientness of knowledge was around this city. So he was born in this metropolis of Islamic learning. He tried to compile, and during his lifetime, he tried to compile the most authentic traditions into very simple collections that can be digested by common people. So the Jews had this method, which was, and even the Christians used it too, which was like this. Only the scholars know what the book says, and the scholars tell you what it says. So if the scholar tells you that, then that's what it is. because you yourself cannot read it. And so in Islam, our scholars try to break this. They try to make Islam digestible so that you don't need a cleric or you don't need a person to come and tell you basic things about your religion. Imam Nawawi was one of those people. One of his most famous works, which is still read today, I'm sure many have heard it, is called Riyadul Salihin, which is a life biography of the Prophet. It's one of the more scholarly verb too. I'm overusing the word scholar. I don't know how to use how to explain, but I think that's the best way. Scholarly researched biographies of the Prophet. So, for example, you have another Life of Prophet Muhammad by Martin Lings. So Martin Lings, he does cite his sources. He doesn't use any Arabic. So when you read his statements, it's hard to tell, is that the accurate translation or not? Martin Lings, he wrote more for entertainment than he did for historical accuracy. Imam Nawawi wrote for historical accuracy. So Riyadul Salihin is a little bit more difficult to read, but in my opinion, it's far more accurate when it explains about the life of the Prophet. And Imam Nawawi cites all of his sources. And citing our sources is an important aspect of our faith. Whenever we teach it, we always want to try to cite our sources. But the book that I want to speak about that is more relevant to us is called The 40 Hadith. The 40 Hadith by Imam Nawawi. The 40 Hadith is a book that I recall when I first became Muslim. There were two books they gave me other than the Quran. There were two books they gave me. The first book was called A Belief in Teachings, which I love this book even to this day. It's hard to find, but the brothers and institutions, they use this book. And I later learned, years later, that it kind of comes from Hanafi fiqh, the Hanafi explanation of Islam. But it's a great introductory tool. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't kind of explain its sources. Like it explains, 5 pillars, right? Or it explains, 6 articles of faith. But it doesn't explain it because it makes it digestible. It makes it so that a new person can just digest it and know, oh, okay, there's 5 pillars in Islam. But they may not have an interest of, where does that come from? Who said it? Why did they say it? And is it authentic tradition, right? That comes later in your studies. So, but Imam Nawawi took a different approach. He kind of created the year 1200 version of A Belief in Teachings. And so the second book that I was given is called The 40 Hadith. And you'll notice if you've been a Muslim for any amount of time, you have come across this book, The 40 Hadith. So if you ever wondered, well, why is it so popular in the Muslim world? Today you're finding out why it's so popular. Why the 40 Hadith? Imam Nawawi's collection still has a profound impact to this very day. So it gives a person a well-rounded view of Islam. Like I said, it was like the year 1200 version of A Belief in Teachings. It gives you tells you about the principles of Islam, Islamic character, and the approach towards applying the religion per the words of the Prophet. It's one of the most widely read books in the Islamic world. And by the way, it stood the test of time since it was put together over 800 years ago. The first book in and I'm going to talk about one hadith today. So that's it. Y'all are just going to get, today I gave a little bit of overview of what is hadith, why is hadith, what makes up a hadith. So now we're going to get into one single hadith. And the hadith, and I'm not going to include the chain. So no, I did not put according to Umar ibn, because this is what it says. It was related by the commander of the believers, Umar ibn al-Khattab, that he heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, indeed, actions are by intent, and a person shall have only that which they intended. Therefore, if a person made the hijrah for Allah and his messenger, then he made the hijrah for Allah and his messenger. But if a person made the hijrah to take a woman in marriage, or a man, if it was a woman, right? Or for some other reason, then that person will receive the reward for that which he intended. Rawahi Sahih Bukhari wa Muslim, meaning it was related to us through Bukhari and Muslim. MashaAllah. And as we close today, we're going to talk about this hadith and then I'll go ahead and wrap up for today. But I hope that this topic was not too far out there. I hope it was digestible. I hope it was understandable. And as we get into the actual hadiths that we're going to be discussing over the course of the 40 hadith, it's very interesting that Imam Nawawi started with this particular hadith. And it goes to show the depth of his understanding, because every single action that comes from what we do is built and based on a very fundamental principle, which relates to the nature of our intent. This is a fundamental principle of Islam. So let's break it down just a little bit. The first principle: actions are by intent. Actions are by intent. Inna a'malu binniyat. Innama a'malu. Innama, indeed, the innama a'malu, action, amal, the deed, binniyat is with intention, is by intent. Binniyat. Niyat, we break it down, the word niyat means seed, right? So the seed is the essence of anything. If the seed is a orange seed, then guess what? The fruit will be oranges. If the seed is an apple, then the fruit will be apples. So if the seed is an evil deed, then the fruit will be evil. If the seed is a self-serving deed, maybe it's not evil at all. Like he said, when it says in the hadith, if you went to take a person in marriage, that's not haram. MashaAllah, that's actually halal. But it's a self-serving thing. You did it for your own purposes. And when the Prophet said this, let's back up. Let me back up a little bit. When the Prophet made this statement, you notice in the word it uses hijrah. So the hijrah, that tells us that he was speaking to the people who were reluctant to follow him. So the first and foremost, the Sabiqun, during the time that the Prophet was speaking in Mecca, the Sabiqun were those people who followed him, and they're considered the most sincere believers. Why? Because there was no benefit to becoming a Muslim. To becoming a Muslim was a liability. If you became a Muslim, just know you were going to gain Allah's love. You were going to gain paradise, inshallah. But your family, your money, your job, your culture, your friends, your social club, it's all going away, brother. It's all going away because it was such a crisis at the time. So for those people who came into Islam, they're considered to be those people who truly believed. Then when the Prophet migrated to Mecca, those who followed him were the next in succession, because it took time for them to let go of their whole vision of Mecca. It takes time for people to let go of what they're used to and to embrace something that may have risk, may have loss. And so you can so this hadith actually sets us in that moment where people were migrating to Medina, but some of them had various different intentions for why they were going to Medina. So in order to help clarify, okay, let's just understand this here. If you're coming to Medina for Allah and for his messenger, mashallah, you're going to receive the reward. And what is the reward for that? Jannah, paradise, mashallah. But if you're coming here because someone's here that you love and you want to marry them, you're coming to follow a family member, you're coming for the culture or whatever, well, then guess what? Then you will get that, but you will not get the other. You see? Actions are by intent. And there's another thing about this. And also, oftentimes we have actions that maybe you intended it for it to be good, but it came out bad. Have you ever did something that you had the right intention? You were like, bro, I really was just trying to help those people, and it just because I've done it. I've like called a relative trying to make up, and it just went bad. We got into an argument, we cussed each other out. Okay, so what was the deal there? So this hadith lets me know that Allah received my intent, that my intent, although it didn't work out right, it just went bad, that my initial intent was what Allah received, and he judged my actions based on that. MashaAllah. So this is a profound hadith by which we should judge all of our actions, and we should say, okay, well, if I'm going near this event, what am I going for? Am I going for me and Allah, for Allah and his messenger, and my love for him? Or am I going because, man, Brother Amir, he been bugging me, so I'm going to go because I want to let Brother Amir down? No, man. We got to get our intentions in the right place. And so this actions of my intent hadith comes before the other 39 hadiths so as to set the tone. If you pray for Allah because of Allah and his messenger. If you fast for Allah and his messenger. If you give charity, you don't give charity to be seen. You don't give charity. Say, yeah, man, I gave $1 million so I can get on TV and people, I gave $1 million to the needy. You'll get that reward, but you will not receive the reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, Allah knows best about this. So the first principle, a person's actions are judged not by the content of the action, but by the actual intent in the heart, which forms the basis of the act itself. Back to the niyyah, the seed. If the seed is good, the fruit will be good. If the seed is evil, the fruit will be evil. A person will only have the reward with Allah. And we understand that this is actually a faith-based principle. This isn't about a dunya thing, like what will I get in this world? And in fact, yes, if you want the reward in this world, you will receive your reward in this world, but you will not receive your reward in the hereafter. And I'm sure there are many verses in the Quran which substantiate this statement. With that, brothers and sisters, that brings us to the conclusion of my discussion today. We covered one single hadith, but we got a very kind of a brief introduction and overview to what hadiths are. Before I ever start talking about hadiths with a general audience, I always want to make sure that we're understanding it from the same perspective and that you have just at least a little bit of a basic idea before we launch into talking about the sayings of the Prophet, that you know the value of the sayings of the Prophet and the rigorous study and scientific research that goes into this. And by the way, the modern jurisprudence system is built upon the hadith analysis developed by Muslims. So thank the Muslims. Have you not heard that a person cannot be indicted or convicted of a crime if they did not have the intention to perform that crime? So the judge and jury also look at the intent of that person before they convict him. Now, of course, we know that doesn't go in practice. It sounds beautiful in principle. In principle, that's how they apply it. But in practice, we know that it's often not done quite like that. So I thank everybody. I don't see any particular questions in the chat. If there's anyone listening that has a question, wants to throw it up there real quick, that's fine. Otherwise, I do look back later on and I'll answer those down the line. I thank everybody for their participation, for their support of our community. Please continue to support Masjid New Africa in our efforts. Without your support, we don't exist and we cannot continue to do the work that we do out here in the community. We love the work we do. We do it in support of the people, and we do it in support of promoting the human development. We are a center for human development. That means all humanity, not just people of color, people of every color, right? People of every color, qualification, quality, and content. We are looking to promote ideas that promote humanity, that promote the betterness of people, that bring community together, that develop the community. And we love our participants and our supporters. Thank you for everything that you give to us. And please continue to donate generously. With that, I will turn it over to our program sponsor, our program MC, Sister Latifa. And let me close out briefly with a dua. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. By the token of time and through the ages, verily man is at loss, except such as has faith and does righteous deeds and joins together in the mutual teachings of truth, patience, and constancy. Amen.